everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to the Sci-Fi Center Presents. This isn't the Sci-Fi Center Live like we usually do on most Fridays at 6:30 p.m. This is the Sci-Fi Center Presents. We generally don't do this live, but I have circumstances today. I had the day off from everything. The store's closed on Monday. We're about to head off to see in about a couple hours to see Top Gun Maverick, movie I've been waiting for since my childhood. So I decided we want to do this live. What the Sci-Fi Center presents it's a loose, non-structured conversation about stuff that really, had an influence on me growing up, had an influence on me even having a place like this, especially as a collector. We talk about things like pop culture stuff, mainly for the first few of them. If you haven't missed them, go back and watch. We've done The Watchmen, The Legacy of the Watchmen. We've done Frank Miller's Dark Knight. In the future, it won't all be comics. Like, for instance, one of the next episodes we do are going to be the 40th anniversary of Blade Runner and the influence of Blade Runner on science fiction. That will be next month, 40 years since the original Blade Runner has been released. We're going to be doing one on X-Files, and then we'll go back and forth, comics, things like that. Anything that, at least for me, had a influential bearing on what I ended up becoming, the geek that I am today. So it's literally just a personal conversation between me and you about what those things meant to me, and then what they mean to you, like people in the chat, people that we'll bring on, people that we'll talk to. Each one of these things that we do for the Sci-Fi Center Presents means something different to each and every different person. So that's why this kind of forum is kind of cool. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in one of my co-pilots, Said. What's going on, Said? How you doing?
Not much, man. Just getting in the spirit with the avatar there.
I see it. So we're going to do some history here, and we are going to go ahead and start out with the Uncanny X-Men. Today's topic is Chris Claremont's run on Uncanny X-Men, which basically lasted from X-Men 94, even though it wasn't called Uncanny till 114, it was pretty much used. Uncanny X-Men 94 to Uncanny X-Men roughly around Uncanny X-Men 280, which was in 1991. That is a run that lasted from 1975 to 1991. It's one of the longest single runs. I think it may be the longest single run of any particular talent on a specific title.
He was 17 years. He was 17 years in.
17 years. He did a lot. He created a lot of characters. Let me go ahead and let's get started with something that a lot of people don't. And let's bring it in. X-Men began in 1963 with X-Men #1. So there we go right there. Now, obviously, we're talking about Chris Claremont's run on X-Men today, but it doesn't start without this one. 1963 is when this was released. The world was different. We had the Kennedy assassination. We always bring this up with and some of the other things I'm involved in. When X-Men first came around, the world was different, and as the world changed, the comics changed. And if you look at what X-Men is right now, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby created this. A lot of his original vision ends up bleeding over into what Chris Claremont would eventually be able to do. In 1963, you weren't going to get the type of diversity past the censors and past the powers that be. We were still in the middle of the civil rights, or in the beginnings of the civil rights era. We had a lot of stuff going on. We hadn't ramped up into Vietnam yet. So the metaphors here that not Chris Claremont, that Stan Lee, mutants was the other. And if you were in the 60s, the other, a lot of the times that meant people of color. Magneto and Professor X being Malcolm X, Professor X, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and then Magneto being a Professor X type of protagonist, because that was going on then. Obviously, you wouldn't have been able to put that in a kid's comic, or what was perceived as a kid's comic, but a lot of these guys, they knew what the world was going through. X-Men #1 came out. The original X-Men comic ran from 1963 to 1970. Here's something that a lot of people don't know, unless you're a hardcore collector, unless you're hardcore. The comic actually got canceled as far as a first-run comic in 1970. And it would basically run in reprints from 1970 until Giant Size X-Men #1, when they relaunched the comic book. So if you were buying X-Men from 1970 to 1975, you were basically buying a reprint that happened in the prior era. In 1975, they relaunched it with Giant Size X-Men #1, and that is where the very next first run issue after that was X-Men 94, and that was Chris Claremont's very first episode. I'm talking TV. That was Chris Claremont's very first issue, and a run that would basically last from the time I was 1 year old to I was 16. I mean, that is some awesome math. I don't know if you're ever going to see a run like that in the modern era, as far as that kind of longevity. It just doesn't happen. Let me bring up a lot of people will not recognize this issue, but X-Men 94. It was the very first story that the new team came on to. And characters like Thunderbird are here, Count Nefaria. There's the SR-71 that will become famous for their jet. This is the first run. Thunderbird, I don't think he's in this picture, he would die. James Crowder would die the very next issue. There's a current lineup of the X-Men. There's Storm. I mean, this is what X-Men looked like in 1975. This was the very first run, the very first issue of Chris Claremont's run. And it would end, and I'll show that later on, with X-Men 280, which was 1991. I was a junior in high school when that came out, and just
he actually wrote, including the first 3 issues of the X-Men run.
Yeah, and he left because of I think there might have been a conflict of with the editor, from what I remember that, because he wrote. I remember X-Men #1 was one of the biggest selling titles in the 90s. It was in the early 90s, before comic books got to the point where the saturation, in my opinion, really hurt us.
It was one of the very first comics that had multiple covers.
Yeah, it had. Let's bring that up real quick.
And I think it had like 6 or 7 different covers.
It had 5. It had the first 4 character covers, including the one with Magneto solo, and then it had. Let me show you. I actually have it up here. It has a gatefold cover, which you had to wait to get, if I can remember correctly, because that was one of the first times they had done that. They didn't really do that. Let's see. I have it up here. Actually, if you look at the intro, it's on the intro. Here it is. This was the gatefold cover. This is the one that had everything on it. And there you go. So there you go. Now, when these came out, these were all cut up. I mean, you had each of them. If you look in the sections, each of them had a section, and then the last section was right there. And then there's another section on here. I thought I had it up here, and that's the one with Magneto on his own, and it was basically meant to mimic the original X-Men #1 that had come out in 1963. Obviously, their first enemy was Magneto then as well. This was a different Magneto. Chris Claremont had done a lot to transform Magneto's character to the point where he wasn't just an outright villain. He was actually. They told his story to the point where you could kind of sympathize with him, and a lot of Chris Claremont's run had Magneto as one of them. The Mutant Massacre, which is a story I'm going to bring up as one of the most important stories that in comics history, not just in Chris Claremont's run, in comics history. It was Magneto who was headmaster of the school at the time, so he wasn't a villain. So throughout Chris Claremont's term, a lot of characters, you got to see different sides of them, whether they were introduced originally as a villain or, you got to see them. You felt for Magneto, and when he finally went back to being an evil villain, this started off his trajectory, and it would last even after Chris Claremont left the book, in a story called Fatal Attraction, the famous storyline where he removes Wolverine's adamantium from his skeleton. That's this character starts in that trajectory right around then, and during the Jim Lee era and all that. So we went from having a canceled comic to one of the best-selling comics of all time as far as that run goes.
Yep.
I'm going to give you here's something that's awe-inspiring.
And actually, the X-Men #1 issues are still one of the highest-selling comic book runs. I mean, single issues in the world.
Correct, and pre-saturation. When I say pre-saturation, I mean pre-Superman 75.
Yeah.
And where they would print so many that the value would go down, because, like I said, I get people coming in here all the time, saying they got some hot stuff for me to sell, and they pull out Superman 75, and I already got like 15 or 20 of them, over the years that we rotate now. And I've acquired so many of certain comics, because whenever you try to purchase a collection, sometimes you get some duds in there that you don't need, but they're there anyway, and they don't really hurt you. But this was before the print run got so bloated that things weren't collectible anymore. So let me bring up something that when I was doing my research. By the way, when I say research for the Sci-Fi Center Presents, that's basically it's I don't do much. I try to limit it to a conversation that I can engage with you guys in a way that you guys can continue that conversation, just basically using the basic tools that we have out here. The internet is the primary tool. My own knowledge of collecting, that's the one thing I can bring to you that you really can't get on the internet, just my experience of it. And with things like Wikipedia, things like that, so that you guys can carry on the conversation and possibly get into these things. So we'll have some recommended reading and stuff like that. But one of the things that during his 17-year run, I think the most impactful is this. All right. This is from Wikipedia. These are characters created by Chris Claremont. Not just in Uncanny X-Men, but the vast majority of these characters appeared in Uncanny X-Men or another comic we'll jump on, which is New Mutants, because remember, he started New Mutants. The alien race of Canty, the Adversary, which was one of my favorite characters in Fall of the Mutants. Aurora. The Shi'ar, Blockbuster.
The Marauders, the Scout Hunters.
The Marauders, yeah. Saturn.
The Nasty Boys, Mr. Sinister.
I mean, you just look at this list.
Apocalypse.
Senator. Yes, Apocalypse, Callisto, Caliban. I mean, Mask.
Mystique.
Mystique.
Destiny.
You just look at these characters and you just take for granted that they're just there. And you look at this and you're like, holy cow. Betsy Braddock, Psylocke, Jamie Braddock, Captain Britain.
Revanche. He was partially responsible for turning Angel into Archangel.
You have Harpoon in there. That's why we'll get to the Mutant Massacre. Nimrod is a very important character, and he is resonating through all versions.
Days of Future Past.
Yep. Madeline Pryor, a huge character. Proteus, Donald Pierce, the Phoenix Force, and obviously the Phoenix character itself. The Phalanx Covenant, one of the few stories in the 90s that I actually liked. Warlock from New Mutants, Warpath, which is Peter Proudstar's brother, the Warwolves. I mean, this is his legacy. Other than Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, I don't know of too many other creators that can host this type of resume when it comes to characters that create. And remember, when you create a comic book character, you're not just creating that character. It's like children. You're creating, things that are going to reproduce each time that these stories have a character around them. You're talking about another group of characters that have to be created to support that character. So you're creating a lineage is what you're doing. And this guy has a tree that spans like almost 40 years. So that is right there is a testament to what Chris Claremont's run on X-Men meant. Now,
you're talking 46 years at least that Claremont, has been around the industry or in it,
Yeah. Or that his results of his being in it
or that are results of him being there,
because he hasn't been on the X-Men since 91. I mean, he came back and did certain things, but his continuous run ended in 1991.
Yeah.
But
He
if you
came
look
back briefly in the early 2000s.
yeah, and if you look at the things that are around now at Hickman's X-Men, a lot of those characters, all that comes back to things that Chris Claremont, was around and was a big part of.
Well, we wouldn't have like the Days of Future Past movie if it hadn't been for a storyline he wrote. We
Yeah.
wouldn't have, we wouldn't have characters like Deadpool if it wasn't for his influence. We wouldn't have, like you said, there's just so many characters that he was responsible for or helped to expand on that are so important to the X-Men landscape. It was very influential.
Anything that came from New Mutants, because remember, if it's anybody but Chris Claremont at the helm of the mutant ship, the new Marvel graphics novels, and that's another one I'll bring up, doesn't happen, and thus the New Mutants don't happen. And the New Mutants run with Bill Sienkiewicz. That's some of the best stuff. Even now, if you buy the current versions of New Mutants, which I have on the shelf right now, they are harkening back to that first year or so of New Mutants when Claremont and Sienkiewicz really created Demon Bear and the artwork and just the things that he was allowed to do. And because Chris Claremont had taken, which was a dead book, he got the book because they figured giving a young guy like that book wasn't going to hurt anything, because the state of X-Men right now, at that point, was so bad. People don't think about it now. They think of X-Men as being one of the most popular things that ever happened. And we all look at it, even myself, when I was buying it, as a top book around, people look at it as like, there's no way. Same way that they look at Marvel Comics now. When they looked at the MCU and all these $1 billion, whatever that they do, they don't realize that in the early 2000s, late 1990s, Marvel Comics was nearly bankrupt. The reason why they had to sell X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all these things to keep themselves afloat. But we think about it in retrospect now, because that's all we look backwards. But X-Men was not it was a canceled title, and it stayed in reruns for almost 5, 6 years. And Claremont comes around, so he was the right guy at the right time, and he had a lot of leverage because of his success. Books that probably wouldn't have gotten greenlit by any other person, Chris Claremont was able to walk into the office and says, "This is what I want to do," and they did it. So now, I'll ask you this later on in a couple minutes, but probably the most important era for me when it comes to the X-Men is the era I started collecting continuously. And now, prior to 1986, I had picked up X-Men, but I really wasn't in depth. I would see a guest appearance here and there. I knew of them, but I wasn't really diving into it until 1986, the Mutant Massacre. Now, I bought my very first X-Men and to the point where I would never miss an issue again. X-Men 221. I didn't realize how important that episode would end up, issue. I'll do that often, would end up being, because of the fact that we did not know at the time everything about the Marauders, everything about the Mutant Massacre. Remember, this issue right here came out in 1987. It was my first continuous episode that I purchased, and I did not miss an issue all the way up until they ended the comic. And then they did X-Men Blues, Red, Green, and Magenta, all that stuff. Right here, this is the very first comic I bought up. This was my transition between buying comics at 7-Eleven. I bought this at a 7-Eleven right outside of Norton Air Force Base, where I grew up. I had gone to comic book stores, but I was not a customer at one yet. So we were still, and there weren't a lot of them around then in San Bernardino, where I'm from. There was like 2. One of them was Lone Warrior Comics, and the other one was 4-Color Fantasies. There was no, and then San Bernardino was a big city with like 3-4 million people at the time. So we didn't. So I bought this. This one had already been out in other stores late. I bought it. I picked it up. This is the very first appearance of Mr. Sinister. He had been mentioned earlier on in X-Men 210 or 211, and when Psylocke scanned Sabretooth's mind, he'd been mentioned as a person who sent the Marauders to the Morlock tunnels. Nobody knew who he was. He appears at the very first page of this, and he's basically dressing down the Marauders. You realize how powerful the character is when Sabretooth tries to attack him. He grabs Sabretooth by the neck, chokes him, while he continues his conversation with the rest of the Marauders, ordering them to go find, hunt, and kill Madeline Pryor at the time, which was a clone. We didn't know all this at the time. We didn't know that it was a clone and that he was trying to replicate the Summers DNA. We would find all this years later. The title was called Death by Drowning. This was well into Chris Claremont's run. Now, this is 1987. He'd been on the book for 12 years at that point. But at this point, he was the center of everything. This was 11 months after the Mutant Massacre. We, as collectors, were still reeling from the Mutant Massacre because at the time, that wasn't something Marvel was doing. Marvel wasn't doing that kind of violence and killing like that. You could find it in Daredevil and a couple other things, but that gritty back alley violence with the Mutant Massacre and the Marauders represented was not happening in comics. So we were still reeling from that. And then the Marauders would be a constant enemy for like the next 4 years. And this was the first time you saw a character called Malice, which was the psychic entity. She was a Marauder. She took over Polaris, and you'd have to deal with her for a couple of years. But this was a very pivotal issue. This is for me personally, because it was my very first continuous issue in the Chris Claremont run. What was the issue for you, Dave, that might have sparked it?
My very first actual issue of the X-Men was Uncanny X-Men 155, which was the first Brood story.
Ah, yes. You're that
was in March of '82. You
got lucky. You were in an area where you could get to that. Probably I couldn't. Damn it.
Yeah, at the time I had a comic book store that was within walking distance of my house, and I got my hands on. The reason why I actually picked up this issue is because I was, I'd been reading Spider-Man and Batman for a little bit, and I was wanting to branch out in comic books, and I'd heard about the X-Men from a friend of mine. I was 7, 8 years old almost.
Yeah, the same here. I mean, you and me, I literally are the same age. So,
and he had told me about the X-Men books, and he'd showed me one, and I just happened to see this one on the shelf, and I had seen the movie Alien like a year before, and the Brood reminded me of the Aliens.
They were no doubt inspired, yeah.
I picked up the issue, and I've been hooked since. And God, the Claremont era, man, there were so many good storylines. But I'll get into that when we talk about storylines we like.
Yeah, in fact, I'm about to bring up one. So I'm going to go into the chat. And, hey, thanks, Rerun Trading, for coming in. And I don't know if you're here now. I saw this a little bit earlier before the show. Hey, Stella, how you doing? My favorite X-Men stories are Days of Future Past, which I'm just about to bring up, and God Loves, Man Kills. Those are the two good ones. How you doing? How to Fat Black Dude? Hey. What's going on, Music Man? Yeah, he did a lot, and this is why I'm doing this, because I think that a lot of people, I think Chris Claremont, now that we're 20, 30 years beyond his run, I just want to remind people that this guy, you may have been influenced by Chris Claremont, even if you never read his book. If you watched the cheesy animated show, which is a banned topic for me, but hey, but if you watch the movies, a lot of, I think almost all the movies for the most part are loosely based on storylines that he did and the characters that he created. Yes, I agree. The I mean, is undisputed right there. Yeah, and then also Wolverine, the miniseries that he did with Frank Miller was iconic as well. You're gonna hear the word iconic.
Just about to bring that up, actually.
Yeah,
the Wolverine miniseries.
You're gonna hear the word iconic brought up a lot during this this discussion. So let's go to start with one of the big ones. This storyline was huge. I read this storyline long after it had been released. Days of Future Past was released in the 80s earlier.
1981.
Yeah.
1981.
I did not have exposure to comics at that point. I didn't even go.
In fact,
yeah.
The comic book my buddy showed me that wanted me to get into X-Men, he was a few years older than me. The very first comic book he showed me was that cover right there with all the wanted posters.
Yeah.
He showed me that comic. And I did not actually get to read this storyline until about a year after I started buying the X-Men. They had it available at that comic book store. They bought a group of comic books, and they had these issues for the Days of Future Past storyline. in that box, and I bought them because I was really into X-Men by then.
I bought this on Christmas. We were at a B. Dalton bookstore, and there was a game from TSR called Days of Future Past. It was a game based on this. That's how I knew of the storyline, and I'd already been collecting X-Men. But there was just so much, and I was a kid. I didn't have any money. I mean, so, when I got to this storyline, I got into it because it was a video game, not a video game, but a role-playing game. And I went back to get these comics, and I'm like, holy cow. This cover, and a lot of these things that Chris Claremont did throughout his run included every storyline, as a matter of fact, that I can remember, had an iconic cover. And these are two of the most iconic covers. If you like X-Men Days of Future Past, which is one of the better X-Men stories that they did, the comic, or the movies, one of the better X-Men movies, you have this storyline to thank from it. You also have the storyline to thank for, I think this is the very first time we see Rachel Summers as Phoenix.
Yes,
and you realized this story right here, the prejudice with mutants had always been a line that's been drawn from even 1963 all the way up to now. The possible future that this storyline represents drove it home. You drove their plight home. And you actually had a little bit more sympathy for people like Magneto, because this is the ultimate end that he's against.
And actually, one other thing I got to add about this storyline. This is one of the first Marvel stories throughout all of Marvel that mentioned branching timelines. This is where the designations for different Marvel realities came from.
Correct. And it was one of the only ones that had a sustaining reality, because I believe, didn't Nimrod come from this?
Yes.
Nimrod came from, so it had ramifications. Other than that, the only company that was doing sustaining parallel realities was DC, and they'd been doing it for like 60 years. But
yeah,
this is the first.
DC started theirs in the Flash of Two Worlds in 56, I believe.
Well, and then when they would retell new Superman stories and try to tell you, okay, well, the Superman from 1938 is still relevant. We're going to give him some gray hair, and he was Earth One, and then that's a whole stream. But you look at this cover, and then I didn't want to put in the pages in here, but because I want you guys to read the stuff. What happens on that cover happens in the comic book, but it's much more graphic. You actually see a skeleton, the adamantium skeleton of Wolverine. And that was one of the first realizations that people got to see that, because it wasn't really illustrated. Days of Future Past was a very hard-hitting story. In the 1980s, you have to understand that in the 1980s, and now that I've been able to go back over the years and read these comics, the stories that Marvel was telling in 1982, 1981 weren't this type of story. This was a doorway into DC. The closest thing that was happening in the early 80s is Legion of Superheroes. Legion of Superheroes was separated from the continuity because it was in the future. That allowed Levitz and Gibbons and guys like that to do, or Geffen to do, the kind of violence and dark storylines. You could kill a character in the 30th century because it wasn't going to have any major effect. You could do the kind of violence because in 1982, if you were buying these kind of comics, you were buying them from some place that, like a store or places like that, because I couldn't find Legion of Superheroes or things like that on a 7-Eleven. I literally had those little crappy racks, and you had to get the comic in the back because that one in the front was folding because of the way the rack was. And I remember it said, "Hey Kids Comics," and that's how I got my X-Men and stuff in the 80s. So
real quick, I want to answer Ironcaster's question in the chat. Yes, Ironcaster, the 616 numbering did originate from Captain Britain, and it involved the Omniversal Development Court, which was led by Saturnine, who was a multiversal character. But yes, the numbering actually did originate from that, but the idea of branching timelines originated from this storyline.
By the way, that storyline he's bringing up was a Chris Claremont story.
Yes, it was. In fact, Saturnine was a Chris Claremont character.
Yeah, if you look, Roma from there comes back and follow the mutants, and she is the one that brings them back from the life once they go through that gateway. So that's a storyline
through the Siege Perilous.
And they used the Siege Perilous again in a couple other issues after that, when they killed Master Mold, the new Master Mold, the one that had reformed. Okay, so yeah, this was a big story. For me, I'm going to bring up to me, which is the story, the big story, the one that I think set it up. I mean, I got several different covers because to me it was probably one of the most. I have to say, at the time, the most important one. Here we go. All right, and usually I'm not doing these ones live, so give this old man some time to get used to the. All right, Mutant Massacre. Mutant Massacre was it for me. Even though my collecting continuously started a year after this, obviously I had to go back because everything that had been introduced to me in X-Men 221, obviously I'd know about the story because everybody would come and tell me, did you hear what happened? And, and this is how I found out. This was the first major X-Men crossover. And Marvel Comics wasn't doing this. They were doing crossovers, guest appearances, and be continued in other issues and like Secret Wars, Maxi stuff like that. This was an internal crossover that just came about because a lot of the people involved were working with each other already. Thor is in this. Walt Simonson was writing Thor at the time. His wife, Louise Simonson, was editing X-Men, was doing X Factor. So a lot of these guys were working with each other, and they needed books to get the storyline out. So that's how you have Daredevil. I think Ann Nocenti, who was writing editor of X-Men at the time, I think he was, if I'm not correct, was writing Daredevil at the time. Daredevil's in the story. As collectors, we didn't know any of that. We didn't appreciate that. This was killing on a scale that we hadn't seen in comics.
Ironcaster also mentioned the Power Pack because they were involved in this too.
Yeah, and I think that was a Simonson or Nocenti title. So yeah, that I remember that cover because it's Wolverine that saves them. And I remember the cover of Wolverine all ripped up. He had just fought Sabretooth, and then the Power Pack was there. Yeah, correct. The Power Pack.
Well, this storyline involved all of New York City, basically, because there were so many characters involved with this storyline.
Both before and after. I mean, I don't like the retconning of Gambit. That was a mistake for me, but yeah, okay. Because in the it starts out this issue right here where two characters, Tommy and I forgot her who's with the name, but it was a Hellfire guy that she was running away with. Somehow they got from one coast to the other, being broke ass kids, but that was fine. And they're being hunted by the Marauders.
It was Rusty and Skids.
Is it Rusty and Skids? I thought it was Tommy.
I believe it was Rusty and Skids that were running.
No, it was Tommy. It was Tommy because Tommy was a rainbow. She could turn herself into paper. Remember?
Oh, that's right. It was. Yeah.
She was using that to escape, but they had already cornered her. And I remember watching Scalp Hunter aim the. He's reaching for his. The Hellfire boyfriend's reaching for the gun, and that's when you see Scalp Hunter kill somebody for the very first time. He's like, "No more guns for you, no for anything," and then he shoots him point blank. And then they chase Tommy down the color, and they shoot her. And this was. Scalp Hunter was a revolutionary type of villain because of the type of, not just because he was violent, but it was a type of violence. Now, today, we would probably have some issues with it, but we're talking about the Rambo type era. Scalp Hunter was shooting people. And he was shooting them, like I said, point blank. He was shooting it, and his measure of killing during the Mutant Massacre was mass killing. That's how he killed. Him and Riptide killed the majority of the people. Now we look at it today with mass shootings being what they are. Scalp Hunter was revolutionary in the type of violence that he could bring and the way that he bought it. I mean, and this is the opening page of the Massacre. This is them once they had arrived in the tunnels. There you see Scrambler, who was a pretty lame villain, but he was a counter. He had Rogue down there. Arclight, Harpoon, Vertigo, who is not a mutant, she was a mutate. Riptide in the lower background, and then Scalp Hunter and all those weapons. This is John Romita at his best right here. So we had that. That storyline, like I said, this storyline with the Mutant Massacre would lead to annual crossovers that would last forever. This was the first one. The very next one was Fall of the Mutants in 1988. And then you had Inferno in 1989, and Extinction, and Fatal Attraction, all these things that will cross over into these books.
Then Age of Apocalypse. Whoa.
Age of Apocalypse, which would be several years later, but would get its roots from these.
Yeah.
They went. We're going to do one on now in the near future, but that took it to a whole new different level because they just stopped the books. They stopped the books and started them again under new names and everything else. I loved Age of Apocalypse. It's one of the most influential things ever done. And like I said, it owes its lineage to this right here, the Mutant Massacre. Mutant Massacre took place over New Mutants, X Factor. This is when X Factor had just been created, and they were actually in the tunnels with the X-Men. Wolverine knew it because he could smell them, but no one else knew about it. The New Mutants were there. Power Pack was there. Daredevil wasn't in the tunnels, but he fought Sabretooth right outside after he got out. Thor was there, and Thor kicked ass. And I love the way Walt Simonson wrote him. Thor's getting the hell beat out of him, but he's getting gained up on all the Marauders. He comes in, and Angel, he saves Angel because Angel's been harpooned.
Angel's been crucified, basically.
Crucified, and this would lead to a whole bunch of other things. And that's the one.
And that would lead to him losing his wings
and becoming a Four Horsemen. Not Age of Apocalypse, but Fall of the Mutants. This storyline would lead to so many things for the next 20 years. But Thor,
one of the greatest panels was Thor carrying Angel's body out of the tunnels.
Yeah. The other panel was where he just decided he's had enough of Blockbuster. He's getting hell out of him. Finally, he takes on everybody else. And he just basically tells Blockbuster in his Thor way, I'm going to kill you. Like, make peace with your gods or something like that and go to whatever. I forgot the line he used. One blow. Blockbuster had been made to be this big baddie that was actually giving Thor blow for blow battle until Thor said, you know what? I got something else to do. Whacks the shit out or the stuff out of him with his hammer. He goes off panel, and that's it. Blockbuster's dead. And then Thor goes and cleanses the tunnel. And at the time, there was so much confusion because these books were coming out in different parts of the week. There was so much confusion for the X-Men is, they thought the New Mutants were dead because the Thor cleansed the thing, cleansed all the dead bodies. He thought that, that meant that the New Mutants, but they had gotten out. Psylocke became a major X-Men in this character. Betsy Braddock had already been introduced and other things, Brian Braddock, but she became an X-Men a few years later when Sabretooth attacks the mansion and she draws his mind. And once again, that's where we start hearing about the full scope of the Mutant Massacre, who did it, who sent them. They would always keep it an ambiguous mystery until later on when basically they retconned everything after Age of Apocalypse because the Dark Beast had created, the Morlocks had been his experiment, and Mr. Sinister recognized his work and didn't want that work out. So he wiped out the Morlocks. And they basically make it that it was Gambit who got them together and led them to the tunnels. He didn't know that was about to happen. That was kind of weak, but, hey, it is what it is. All right, so let's see. Yeah, these guys were hardcore mercenaries that had never been seen like that. Now we think of it, and this is what I like doing is because we think of these things, we weren't thinking like this in the 1980s. Now we, people killing people, we're doing in comics no matter what, on any scale, it's normal. It wasn't normal in 1985, 1986, 1987. Not in all the books, and you didn't see it in all the books. You weren't going to see this in Fantastic Four. You weren't going to see this in the Avengers. Even at that time in Batman, this is like, this is when Batman started to make that turn in the mid 80s. But prior to that, it was the violence just wasn't there. And if you know me, if you watch any medium I do, I have to have the 3Ds. All right. I have to have death, dismemberment, and destruction.
Yep.
Mutant Massacre was as close as I was going to come in that era. So I was happy. All right. So I thought the Sentinels looked amazing in the Days of Future Past. Yeah. I actually thought that was one of the better things about them. They are always menacing to me in the comics, but I like the way they did them in here. So favorite X-Men groups are X-Force, X-Factor, and the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard had a storyline in X-Men 276 right around that era where Jim Lee was, I think it was Jim Lee was Portatio, and it was still that was one of the last storylines that Chris Claremont worked on. as far as X-Men goes. And I love that story. The artwork in that storyline is great.
Well, I just love the Imperial Guard just in general. I mean, and Claremont was responsible for creating most of them.
Yeah,
Uh,
all of them, every single one of them. That's a cool. He created an entire galaxy of people. It's hilarious. Louise and White Simonson working together to bring Thor and Power back in was great. Yeah, and when you read the backstory of all that, I didn't know this at the time, but that's the way business was done back then. It was kind of cool. It's 1987. Do you know where your children are? One of them is sitting here. Two of them are sitting here. In the 80s, I was living on a space.
Yeah, it says, what do you know what your children are? That was a tagline from one of the comics.
Yeah, I remember that. It was Franklin Richards. They had Franklin Richards as the ad in the comics.
Yeah.
And he was circled because Franklin Richards was a mutant. I remember that.
1987. Cool. Do you know what your children are? Yeah.
I remember. Wow, damn.
That was the tagline. Yeah.
I remember that now. Let's see. Yeah, there was Hellfire Club. He created the Hellfire Club. I mean, he created a lot.
Also, another thing that ties into the Mutant Massacre, the Marauders were one of the first groups that, after they were all killed, were continuously cloned by Sinister.
Yep, Blockbuster was one. Like you said, they did that in Inferno, because if you look at Inferno, they are there. You see them all. He even brought back Prism, which was probably the lamest of the Marauders. And he dies like he should have died because he was kind of stupid. And I remember,
two mutants that could have used their powers simultaneously, though, in the Marauders were Arclight and Prism, because you could have done some pretty interesting stuff using their powers together.
Wouldn't you have? Well, wouldn't have one of them just have destroyed each other? I don't know. Because remember how she killed him? It was Jean Grey just slammed him into a wall. I'm like, you are lame.
Yeah.
He killed the fewest amount of people, and he basically dies. And here's one of the. This was back in 1986. Every issue or every Marvel comic had one of these covers, and it just so happened that the Mutant Massacre took place during this era. So even Thor's version of the Mutant Massacre, it was his face, and he had the beard and the full helmet. And that, if you look closely, all the comic books were around that era, and that was the 25th anniversary of Marvel Comics. So each X-Men had it. Everybody had it. X Factors had Cyclops' head on it, and it was part of the Mutant Massacre. And this was right after the battle, during the battle with Sabretooth, which was an epic battle. It took place over 3 issues, I think. It's in the water. It's in the mansion. It's in the river. I mean, because
Sabretooth kept coming after him, dude. He kept, coming at him.
And then Wolverine kept coming at him. Because remember, they kept diving into the water, and Wolverine, they kept losing each other's scent because that was one of their weaknesses. Neither one of them could sniff through the water. And so they kept losing each other. And I that storyline was great. And here's something that, for the old school people, that when you bought these comics at the time, you got something that was like this. This lets you know, because once again, we did not have the internet. We did not even a crumb of the internet. We had phones and we had comic book stores. That's what we had. Yeah, I know.
Yep.
There you go. So in order for you to keep track of what was going on during the Mutant Massacre, here is your guide. And when you buy the Mutant Massacre trade paperback, this is in it. It's kind of cool. So you see it starts in X-Men 210, goes to X Factor 9, X-Men 211, X Factor 10, New Mutants 46, Thor 373, goes back there to 212, Thor 374, because he actually had 2 issues in it. He was the only non-mutant one that I believe that had more than 1 issue, because
because the Daredevil issue was only a single issue.
And like I said, Thor shines in that. Sure, Thor. Like I said, when he's killed, because you didn't see Thor kill a lot. I mean, he was fighting these big baddies that you always see him vanquish, but you didn't see him actually outright murder some fool. And I just love the way that you just realize all the pussyfooting around that they do with Thor sometimes. That moment, Thor was like, nope, whack. all you see is Blockbuster's feet flying off, and then Thor getting the hammer back, and he knows he's dead. He's gonna make peace with it, whatever. And Colossus, big, peaceful, cuddly Russian Colossus. Riptide, another character. He, for those of you who don't know who Riptide is, I just showed you in that picture. He was a character that could spin at a high rate of speed, and he threw these daggers and shuriken and stars. He killed, probably outside of Scout Puncher, he probably killed the most Morlocks because of the fact that he was just throwing these things. And he lit Colossus up to the point where he was actually penetrating the steel. And he would end up paralyzing Colossus later on because of what Magneto had to do to stop the bleeding because he couldn't transfer back. He snaps Riptide's neck in one of the coolest panels. I should have brought that up. He said, once again, make peace with your gods, little man, and to tell him something. And then you just see the crack and you see a black silhouetted Colossus with a dead Riptide in his clutches. Colossus just... This was a turning point for Chris Claremont's X-Men because of the violence. And they weren't light core after that. I mean, Wolverine himself, the addition of Wolverine himself, a guy with blades on his hands who was a killer, was enough. But this made everybody on Wolverine's level. Storm, everybody. And this was a depowered Storm at the time, too. So that was, it wasn't like she could just bring down lightning. What he did... with Wolverine, and Wolverine was always true to what he was while he was under Chris Claremont's visage. He was a killer. Donald Pierce was a member of the Hellfire Club that Wolverine hacked up so bad that he had to get bionics. Lady Deathstrike. I mean, Wolverine didn't mess around. He was designed to kill, and Chris Claremont had him killed.
The only storyline that was violent really in the X-Men before the Mutant Massacre that was supremely violent was the trade paperback God Loves, Man Kills.
Yeah, and that's another classic that I think this is Marvel graphic novel number 5. A lot of people love this. They actually came out with a continuation of this later, a couple of years back. A lot of people really... not my favorite one. I mean, graphic novel number 4, obviously. I don't refer. I mean, this is, like I said, people love the story. It wasn't for me at the time. I still don't connect with it. Even though I understand it's one of the greats, I just didn't connect with it like I did with his other stuff. What do you think about this one?
I actually enjoy this story because it mostly ties into, of course, it introduces William Stryker, who became a character in the Fox movies. It introduces that storyline. It was also very it tied into the whole theme of the X-Men. It tied into the adversity. Those kids were killed because they were mutants. The kids whose deaths set this storyline off. And it wasn't originally supposed to be canon, but it's been made canon.
Yeah, they've retconned a lot of stuff during that era. So yeah, it was and like I said, as these stories went on, you understood it's not mutant isn't just a word to describe some cool.
It also had one of the most badass soliloquies from Cyclops near the end of it when he's talking to Stryker. And he's talking about being a mutant and all of that. It just was a badass little him trying to be a teaching, character. Him trying to explain,
Yeah, it's got some dialogue in there that kind of sticks with you. Let's see. Some of the like I said, Mutant Massacre for me was big. Follow the Mutants came right after that. One of the biggest storylines ever, and once again, we have a storyline that not only was good at the time. This is before I was collecting on a continuous basis, but stands up to this day, and that's the Dark Phoenix Saga.
God, yeah.
This is this started back in X-Men 101. With her getting the Phoenix power, the whole storyline that the space shuttle crashing that she was on, the radiation. And obviously, years ago, we would find out that it wasn't really Jean Grey. Jean Grey had been cocooned, and we would find that out in Avengers 263. And then it would happen, when they reformed X Factor. This storyline was huge because it led to, since Sinister couldn't get his hands on the original Jean Grey, to basically try to, create his super mutant that he would eventually try to create. He created Madeline Pryor. And then when this character came about, obviously this leads to Rachel Summers because, that's her and Scott stayed together. She never became evil in that timeline. The Phoenix Force was one of the few galactic type things that they had done at the time with the X-Men. This brought in Space Jammers. This brought in, the Summers, Scott's father. It brought in the Shi'ar Empire. I mean, it brought in everything. It brought in everything, and for a couple of years during the
and it was also the reason for the birth of the third Summers brother as well. Well, what happened to the Summers? But he was kind of a shadow into this storyline, Gabriel Summers.
Yeah, which I wish they would have done. One of the worst things that they've done is him, not his creation, but the stories that they've done with him. I hope somebody someday comes along and write, because he's a great character, he has great potential, but they've done some really stupid things with him. That's a different topic, but this character right around this time, this is where you had the Brood, the Shi'ar, all these. We have left the planet now with his storytelling, and it was great. I mean, when I go back and read these issues, I'm like, this is phenomenal.
Well, this storyline right here also, because before this, Jean Grey was just kind of a damsel in distress. She really wasn't much of a character. And this storyline, the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga, really, really cemented her as an integral part of the X-Men, to be honest. I mean,
yeah. I mean, she became a threat, and I remember I remember all this stuff, and them having to destroy her. That iconic
on the blue side of the moon.
Yeah, I remember. I think I might have uploaded this. Is the iconic cover here that they did. But remember it's a cover that they kind of copied in Crisis with the Supergirl and Superman. It was this cover, right? I think I downloaded where it's Cyclops holding her. Here we go. If you remember, and like I said, because of us old guys, we do remember this cover.
Yes.
And this was done in 1980? What year was this? This is 1982, right? 1982, 1983?
136. Let me look that up real quick.
That would have been 1982, I believe.
I think so. Hold on. Let me be sure of that.
The John Byrne cover.
136.
And this is actually a misleading cover because
it was August 1980.
Okay, so 6 years before Crisis copied this cover, John Byrne and I'm pretty sure there was a mutual respect amongst may he rest in peace, George Perez, and there was probably there's no disrespect intended. This is a John Byrne cover. This is the issue before they killed her with that blast from the moon, and then that's when you wouldn't see her again for another 5 years because it was X Factor. X Factor came around in 5 years, and they found her in the cocoon, and that's where Marvel Death started to mean nothing because they basically brought her back because they wanted to bring the.
Well, then actually, when they decided to do that, that pissed off Chris Claremont. I watched a video. He talked about it. He said, it would, because by the time they brought her back, Scott was with
Madeline.
Scott was with Madeline. He had a son. They had just done the wedding a year before that, and his argument with it was that it would make what hero would leave his wife and son to go. He
was an asshole. He was.
It really cheapened Cyclops.
They retconned it.
Yeah.
They retconned it. They basically said in retrospect that it was Sinister mentally messing with him because he needed he didn't want that union to happen now. He needed the union between Madeline Pryor because that was his clone. So he basically was messing with mentally to get him to leave her. In reality, it was just bad story writing that Chris Claremont didn't have any control over.
Yeah, let's acknowledge DC Talk real quick with the membership.
Okay, thank you. I think that's my first one during a show that I'm doing. Thank you, DC Talk with Extended. I hope you're enjoying the content that not only I'm putting out here, but Point Extra Lounge, Jive with Jack, all these other guys. And, if you get a chance, I'll put the link into my own page over there because we're going to start doing a lot more content there. I'm building a studio in the store, a walk-in studio.
DC Talk, I would also like to also say thank you for becoming a member. We appreciate all of our members here at the Point Extra Lounge and, of course, the Pantheon. So we appreciate you. Thank you very much, sir, for becoming a member.
Else? Cool. I didn't miss anybody before I go on. All right, cool. So I got him. So some of the other storylines that when it comes to Chris Claremont, I mean, we have the Mutant Massacre. We covered Dark Phoenix Saga. Man loves, God kills.
God loves, man kills. You flipped the name. See, some of my favorite storylines, the two most influential storylines to me, of course, are the Phoenix Saga, and of course, Mutant Massacre, Days of Future Past. Those are my three favorite Claremont storylines. I also secondarily love Inferno. I think the Inferno story is integral, and Fall of Mutants was very integral.
Speaking of Fall of Mutants, at this point as a kid, I was full-fledged in. I had gotten all my Mutant Massacre issues. I had lived the storyline that went all the way up to this. This was the second one, and this is when you started realizing this was going to happen every year.
We have a super chat.
Where we go? What did I miss?
Silent. Super chat. Silent Scotty.
Oh, it's an apology one. No, I'm just kidding. I understand. Sorry, guys. I had really sick. Hey, I hope you're doing. I hope you feel better, dude. I know you got hit up by, I think it was COVID. I'm not ML, but
Silent, I hope your dad gets to feeling better. And we look forward to you returning. And thank you for the $9.99. We appreciate it always.
Yeah, man. Take all the time you need and give my regards from behalf of the Sci-Fi Center, the Point Extra Lounge, and everybody in the chat. Hopefully your dad pulls through and comes out on the other side of all this. So keep us posted. I know you were sick a couple of weeks ago and weren't feeling too well, but I did not know about your dad until now. So, hey, don't worry about this little thing we do here if you can't make it. Family first, man. And I'll be checking in on you and hoping that he's doing better. Feel free to send me a message and anything, keep me posted. But I hope everything you send me is going to be good news about that. So, all right, man. Follow the Mutants. This is the second one. This is really good. This from the X-Men side of it, which Claremont was handling, he handled the whole storyline. But once again, Simonson and everybody else did their own things. X Factor did their own things. Follow the Mutants is where you first saw Warren Worthington III come back as Archangel. So now we're starting to have reverberations of what had gone before the year before Mutant Massacre. Each of these things carry, even Inferno, the one you just brought up, had consequences of the Mutant Massacre because Madeline Pryor became a huge factor. But Follow the Mutants, this is where Storm got her powers back. Because Forge, who had shot her to begin with, had being
death, a love story.
Oh yeah,
that was a great story. Yeah, that was a great story.
There's so many. There's just not enough time. Damn it. But he had created a weapon that cost her powers because she got in the way of somebody else. But he was also the one. This entire storyline was about him getting his powers and fighting a being called the Adversary, which they would all end up fighting. This all ties back to Roma in the 616 in the that universe because Roma is the one that helps him out at the end of this. X Factor, they were fighting Cameron. No, it wasn't Cameron Hodge. It was Cameron Hodge.
It was Cameron Hodge.
It was Cameron Hodge, and I think Warren Worthington would kill him, and the Extinction Agenda, which would happen a couple of years later, would be the right and all these other goofy machinations because he'd beheaded him. He used his wings to behead him. The wings actually did it on their own, but it was hilarious. It was great. Once again, 3Ds, dismemberment. So that happened. That's when they first saw Caliban. Caliban was in the mutant tunnels. They had changed him. Apocalypse. This is where Apocalypse started to take hold. Apocalypse was a big enemy prior to this. He had first appeared in X Factor number 5, and number 4 in Shadows, and then Full View in X-Men number 5. Nobody really understood what the hell he was. He only his own description was all we had to go on. And remember, he'd only been around for a few years at the time that this came around. Once he starts taking hold and doing what he did with Angel, doing what he did with other mutants and everything else, then you start to understand what Apocalypse would be. And then 8 years later, Apocalypse would be literally a mega event character on his own. Age of Apocalypse would happen, and then so his importance started here. So X Factor, I forgot. Oh, Mutants. That's where I'm not sure if that's where I forgot what was going on with the Mutants, because I don't think Chris Claremont was writing it at the time. If I may be mistaken, if you can look that up for me. But I was focused mainly on X-Men, and obviously this topic is Chris Claremont's X-Men.
Okay, so the Fall of Mutant storyline had Captain America was involved in it, Daredevil was involved, the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, Power Pack. They brought in a whole lot more of the other Marvel heroes into this storyline.
Now, the difference between the Fall of the Mutants and the Mutant Massacre, they were all surrounded by what was going on in the Morlock tunnels and what the Marauders are doing. Fall of the Mutants was different. It was each mutant group was dealing with its own crisis. The X-Men were
this is where the tagline that Ironcaster put in, it's 1987. Do you know what your children are? That's where that poster came from. Was this storyline?
Yeah, because it was the end of 1987. They were promoting it, and this is when you promoted it way in advance, because this title would happen, I think, in fall of '88 was when this came, because I know in '89 it was Inferno. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, that's what corrupted her. That's when they really made her dark. So
it was all Mastermind's fault.
Yeah, it was Mastermind. I remember Mastermind. The Hellfire Club. This is to let you know what kind of influence and leverage Chris Claremont had at the time. We're selling comics to kids, and we got basically half-naked women wearing garters and bustiers and dressed up like hookers. Emma Frost, Black Queen, they were literally half-naked, and they were drawn by some of the best artists at the time. The Mark Silvestri run, which ran from the issue that I brought up, I think X-Men 221 was roughly his first one as a continue. He lasted for a good 4 years. He would go on to do the Wolverine continuous series that came out and Marita. And this Chris Claremont run made so many careers. Jim Lee, X-Men 266, Jim Lee, Willis Portacio. There's so many, Joe Madura, there's so many artists that got their run. It's some of these storylines that we think of today, and it's like, wow, damn, this is some good stuff. So Fall of the Mutants was great.
Fall of the Mutants,
like I said,
one of the major things about Fall of Mutants was it involved one of the major deaths during Fall of Mutants was the mutant Cypher of the New Mutants.
Yeah, Doug, that was it. I remember.
Doug died during Fall of Mutants. He was shot saving Wolfsbane.
I remember that. And then obviously another meaningless comic book death, because guess what would happen with him? He came back.
But he became more than that though. When he came back, he became Douglock. He was bonded with Warlock, and that's part of the Flanks.
The Phalanx Covenant, which was actually a pretty good storyline, given the fact that it was released at a time when the storylines to me were starting to get watered down. It was just not, everybody's going to have their opinion about the 90s. I think as a dealer, and remember, I'm a dealer now. I'm no longer just a comic book collector in the 90s. I'm a dealer. I'm selling these things, and I'm seeing where the sales are going up and down, and I'm seeing how many copies that you have to order to be able to meet minimums and stuff like that. The comic book companies at the time were basically enticing you and restructuring things so that you bought as much as possible of a comic so that they could lower their liability. So if they printed 1 million copies, they structured your discount so that you had to order it if you wanted to get the top selling comics. So a little store like me kind of suffered, but then at the same time, some of these issues that came out, like the Families coming in Wolverine Fatal Attraction with the lenticular holograph cover. Remember all that? Those are
Yeah.
things that when you think about them, they would be worth a lot of money. They're not. They printed so many of them, so that even the special gimmicks that you were doing that made the comic more expensive, you ended up losing money on them. So, when it goes to certain storylines, let's go back. Chris Claremont didn't just let me read some of the stuff from Wikipedia here, because Wikipedia, once again, I'm using Wikipedia not because I'm lazy. I am lazy, but not in this story. I'm really doing Wikipedia because I want anybody who's finding out some of this stuff for the first time or not new. This is where you can go to get it, and then you can go from there. You don't have to take any source that I give you to heart. I want you to actually go out and get these trade paperbacks. So let's see. All right, Claremont launched various spinoffs, beginning with New Mutants in 1982, Marvel graphic novel number 4. Spinoffs like Excalibur, Wolverine, and initially written by Claremont, and the first 3 issues of the actual X-Men title, which was not Uncanny X-Men, which was Jim Lee's X-Men one we've already gone over. Go ahead, Thade.
Oh, no, I was agreeing with you.
Okay, so this is another really important one. Man, in this book right now, in fact, you know what? I should have been ready, but hold on. Go ahead and stall for me, Thad. I want to go grab something real quick that's kind of relevant to this.
So on this cover here, we have, of course, the professor sitting in the back there in his wheelchair. We have Cannonball, Sunspot, Karma, and Danny Moonstar are the characters that are on the cover of this comic. The New Mutants comic led into X-Force and introduced characters. And from the New Mutants, you got introduced characters like all these characters here on the cover, with the exception of Professor Xavier. But the New Mutants series led into Deadpool, led into Bishop, Domino. All of these characters came about because of New Mutants.
All right, I want to show you. This is 1982. Wow, 40 years ago that was done. But all right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the share screen real quick here, and I'm going to show you some of the things. Let me use one of the tricks here. All right. This is from a relatively new New Mutants.
Yeah, you might want to take that off the screen so people can see it. There you go.
This is if you look at the comics that were created in the 80s, this comic cover is replicating what Bill Siekiewicz run on that comic was. The painted sketch type covers. These are the type of comics, and if you go back, and I don't have any of them here right now, right here, and this is one that caught my eye. This is what the New Mutants looked like in 1982, 1984, 1985, during the height of the Bill Siekiewicz era, during his run with Chris Claremont. Here's another one. Now, this is not him. This is Simmons is the artist on this one. But once again, go back and look at the Siekiewicz run on that when Chris Claremont was doing these comics.
Yeah, I like that they're harkening back to the old art with these covers.
And this is here we're just talking about in front.
Then, of course, we've got Madeline Pryor, Goblin Queen.
And then a lot of now. If you get a chance to go back and take a look at the old New Mutant stuff, you'll see that the painted covers and the panels, this is what they did back in then. This is the way that story was written. So the people that are doing New Mutants now are drawing direct lineage from the New Mutants from then. 40 years since the very first appearance of the New Mutants. 40 years since Marvel graphic novel number 4. And that's what I mean about Chris Claremont's influence. That's what I mean. It's been decades, and we still got people holding on to the type of storylines that Chris Claremont has put. All right, I thought Emma Cross was nothing but and you know what? I can't blame you because of the way they made her look. And I didn't know she was part of the Sleeping Scott, but she's also one of the most powerful telepaths ever. Emma Frost
and created by Claremont.
The entire Hero Play and Celine, Sebastian Shaw, all these guys, they were dressed up like 19th century, brothel looking thing. She'd have like a crop. I mean, she was like literally wearing in her underwear. She was wearing panties, garter, and a bustier, and a comic book. That was her
And long stockings.
Oh yeah, fishnets, baby. So let's see. Not a bad cover. Yeah, these covers were great, man. I don't know about that. Yeah. Hey, this is like I said. I'm here. Think of a boulder at the top of a cliff. I'm here to just give it a push, and wherever you guys go with it, there's no wrong answers to anything that we're doing with Sci-Fi Center Presents. All it is a primer to start this conversation going. I'm not even going to be right all the time. There's probably a good chance that I'm right or wrong 50% of the time, but that's not the point. Right or wrong is not the point with the Present show. It's to get the conversation going. And if you have a different thing to say, I'll bring it up in here because it's been a long time. I mean, it has literally been 30 some odd years sometimes. I mean, like I said, 1987 was when I picked up my first continued. We're talking about people who were born then that are old enough to drink, have kids, and are on their second or third job. So the memory might flip me, but like I said, it was mainly to get the conversation going and get people involved. The thing about comics right now is there's so much past because of the movies, because of everybody's doorway right now is through video games and movies, that they don't realize that the heart of this stuff is in the paper medium. It's in the comic book. It's in the
Will, I'll be right back. Give me just a second.
No problem. And what I mainly want to do is start the conversation and get people into the paper medium, especially when it comes to comics. When it comes to other things, video games, some of you guys, X-Men for you is the animated series. Sorry. I hated it. But if you loved it, that's great. But now that you've come through that doorway, a lot of the stuff, at least the good stuff about the X-Men, the animated series, was influenced by Chris Claremont's run on X-Men, 16 years. And the cartoon didn't come too soon after that, or too late after that. So we were dealing with a lot of just crazy stuff then. So, like I said, Chris Claremont's run on X-Men was epic. Some of you who will see this at a later date, some of you that are looking at it right now, may not understand. Just like people when we do Blade Runner, Blade Runner is going to have influenced people without them even knowing it. A lot of people who are into anime, a lot of the dystopian people, if you haven't seen Blade Runner, you may have seen 3 or 4 things that have been heavily influenced by it. So it's the same thing with Chris Claremont. All right, so how do I hate the animated series? Hate's a strong word. A lot of it is because the run of Chris Claremont built a grittier, more violent, more grounded, more realistic, more relatable X-Men. And to me, they took the same thing with Batman the animated series. In order for them to make it safe for kids to watch, they had to take away the edge that made the X-Men what they were. So you were inspired by something that you can no longer use because you're afraid that kids, might not take well to the sheer darkness and violence of what the characters are. I don't like that. I don't like if darkness and violence is part of what that character is, then that's the character. If you put anything less than that on the screen or any interpretation, that's not the character anymore. And a lot of in the 90s, it was a big thing to try to carry these things over and make cartoons out of them. A lot of us that were 15 and 16-year-olds at the time, I didn't need a cartoon. I had already seen the Mutant Massacre. I had already seen the Fall of the Mutants. I had already seen Angel harpooned up on a wall in a tunnel. I didn't need you to soften up the X-Men for me, but you know what? Hey, to each his own.
Okay. Now, I will say this though, we wouldn't have had that animated series had it not been for Claremont.
Yeah, and I think that's why I hate it more, because you wouldn't have had it if it weren't for Claremont, but you took all the edge that Claremont added to that title in the previous 15 years to it away. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You have it because of this guy, but the things that guy meant to that IP, you took away. So it's sort of but hey, you know what? Like I said, that is my opinion about animation in the 90s.
Just to give an alternate view on it, William doesn't like the cartoon very much. I liked it. I thought it had some pretty good storylines. And it was a bit softer than the comics, I will agree, because the storylines in the 90s in the comics were still somewhat brutal. I mean, things like Fatal Attractions and Age of Apocalypse were mind-numbingly brutal. Hell, even the Phalanx Covenant that you mentioned, Blink died during that, and she died due to her own powers,
Yeah, another meaningless comic book death. Spoiler alert. She was a kick-ass character. They actually bought her back because she was such a popular character, and she becomes
Well, the thing
really
is, though, is
popular.
like, but it wasn't our 616 Blink though. She stayed dead. Don't the where Blink where we got Blink then was Age of Apocalypse.
Yeah, which I'm okay with. We actually got
Because the
Dark Vision.
version of Blink in Age of Apocalypse was a badass.
Yeah, that she never got to become because of the other stuff that's going on. So a lot of let's see what we're going over here. And when I say that certain artists made their bones, and listen, John Romita Jr. was already a good artist. He was already known.
Len
People knew who he
Wiseman.
was. But the
You
Mutant
had Len
Massacre,
Wiseman, which was
yeah,
an amazing artist. It's Sienkiewicz.
this is
God,
right
there were
after Austin
several.
Powers. This is when X-Men, this is X-Men 185. This is a John Romita cover. He had a pretty lengthy run on X-Men too. His run lasted from a little bit before this. I mean, this the mid 70s, I think, all the way up until 212.
Yeah,
And that's and then they had a couple artists in between. And like Alan Davis, somebody. Then they
and
went into Mark
you
Spector.
could always recognize Ramita's art, always, because it
Him and
had this
Byrne,
style right
that
here.
that boxy the dimensional. He took away a dimension, and a lot of people didn't like it at the time. A lot of people hated John Romita at the time because of that
But
style.
then you also had all of like the embellishments around the edges there, that black and yellow there. You always had stuff like that with his art.
Yeah, he did a lot. He did a lot for a lot of comics. And like I said, I think a lot of people in retrospect started to understand what that kind of simplicity when it came to like the episode that I brought up, X-Men 221. That was a Mark Silvestri episode. This one right here. Here's another one that he did. Let me see if I can get into it. I got so many screens up. Stop screen. And his run really was the most influential on me. I know Jim Lee has the name notoriety, but when you go to Mark Silvestri's, I think, damn, I can't find a good one. It's this one. Let me see. That was a Jim Lee. I think that's a Jim Lee cover. I'm trying to find some of the. Here we go. Some of the better covers that he did. He did a lot of them, but I had a couple of favorites here that it would not let me bring up. Let's see. Right after the episode or the issue where I first came on with it, it was this one right here. It's this one. And this is where now what he's doing there on the cover is not is pretty PG to what he does to him in the comics. I remember this issue because this is, like I said, this is my second issue in my long run of X-Men. They're fighting I think it was in San Francisco. They're fighting on a bridge and they're going blow for blow. And I think Sabretooth is about to suffocate. He's doing something to him where he's he's got the upper hand, and Wolverine punches him and puts his claws into him. These days, it's nothing. But then, obviously he couldn't kill him, but it was just a graphic of that. This was Mark Silvestri. He had a good 4.5 year run. This led to Wolverine. He did Wolverine, the series. I think he opened up Wolverine series, but he also led him to go to Top Cow and Image. He was one of the very first artists after the original cadre got together with Image, and he created Top Cow, and The Darkness was his. So this is so many artists. And obviously, what happened with Jim Lee. I mean, Jim Lee, is literally the top honcho, or was a top honcho for a while at DC, and he's done a lot of different things. But I remember when Jim Lee first came out, he was during that X-Men 266 was the first Gambit, and then he really made his bones and got real popular with that Shi'ar storyline that we were talking about. So there's a lot of people that I'm not going to say owe their career to Chris Claremont, but you can trace a lot of their success and of their springboard came along with the stories. You know, the only one that even John Byrne to a certain extent. I mean, John Byrne had already it was a pretty big deal, but I mean, his run on X-Men, I mean, look at some of the storylines we touched on that he was a part of. So one last image I want to put here. And this is him. This is Chris Claremont. The way I met him a few times early on in the Comic-Con when you could walk up to guys and just, he'd just be sitting there and he got a name tag. Because remember, we didn't know what a lot of these guys looked like. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have these things where their pictures were everywhere. A lot of times you would walk up, and every now and then you would see a caricature of on a comic somewhere, and it looked nothing like the people in real life. So in the late 80s, early 90s, you would walk up to the Marvel table, and you'd know it was him because he had a Chris Claremont tag, and you got your comic signed. And this was before when Comic-Con was Comic-Con, before Hall H and all the other madness that kind of basically makes it really hard to go and get around. This was when you could go in that same event place, walk up, everybody would have their different tables, big tables, and they would have rotations of artists there. You can meet Frank Miller there, you can meet Klaus Janson there, and you can meet Chris Claremont there. Mark Silvestri, I got all my stuff autographed by these guys. So that's him. So long story short, that's the influence that Chris Claremont had on me personally as a collector. I think he has, between him and Frank Miller at this time, this is the mid-'80s, those two individuals had a profound effect on me as a collector.
I actually got to meet Claremont in '90 at a Comic-Con. I believe it was Chicago Comic-Con.
Yeah, different world then, because I met him then too. I met him at San Diego. Like I said, him and Frank Miller, and together in some cases with Wolverine, had a profound effect on the kind of collector I became, my expectations for reading, how I would present comics in my own store, what I would recommend to people. It had a huge effect on people, and like I said, I hope that if you were not there during this time, that if you do happen upon this stream either today or in the future, you use what we've given you here just to start the conversation. I gave you basically a crumb in comparison to what's out there, but I hope that crumb leads you to the bigger dish, and hopefully made you an X-Men fan today. So I'd like to thank Chris Claremont for doing what he did so that I even have something to stream about, and Dave for hopping on and giving a different perspective about all of this stuff.
And I'd just like to say that a lot of these storylines that we talked about today, you can get in trade paperback format, so you don't have to hunt down the original issues. So that's really easy for people to get a hold of.
Yeah, let's do that. Thanks for reminding me. And I'm going to post I have my own YouTube channel, but there you guys go if you want to join that. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff, both with the Poindexter Lounge and with the Sci-Fi Center's YouTube page. But yeah, thank you for reminding me, because I got some reading material, some homework for some of you guys. Let's see. The Fall of the Mutants one I already pictured there. That is the trade paperback for that. The Mutant Massacre. Let's see. That is all right. So Mutant Massacre, things like this, you can get into straight paperbacks. And the reason why I recommend you straight paperbacks, I know times are tough right now. We're just going through a pandemic. We're just going through people getting back on stable footing. Inflation, prices are different. And even prior to that, comic books have gotten expensive to the point where if you're going to get onto a major storyline, it may be very hard for you to get some of these things. It'll definitely be really hard, depending on your financial situation, to go back into the 70s and get X-Men 94. X-Men, Giant Size X-Men number 1 is super expensive. And some of the ones that Jim Lee's, what Jim Lee would become, they're kind of expensive because of the fact that they were back in there. Things like, here you go with the Mutant Massacre. This is an older trade paperback, but all these storylines like this, they can all be gotten in trade paperbacks, omnibuses. Some of the older stuff, you can get a number of different X-Men omnibus that cover the different areas that we're talking about. For the purposes of this topic, you would probably want to go get an omnibus that covers from 1975 issues 94 and up. They don't give you everything, but they give you big chunks of stuff, and they can usually do it for less than $50. Some of these back issues can cost you in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it really takes you a long time to get the pieces of a storyline together. I'm not saying I want comics to be non-collectible stuff like that. I want them to go up in prices for people who get them. But at the same time, I also want people to be able to enjoy the story and have somewhere where you can jump in without going bankrupt. So things like this, where you have the Mutant Massacre, Follow the Mutants, Wolverine, Chris Claremont, Frank Miller's Wolverine, that can also be everything we've talked about today. All you have to do is when you Google these topics, the very first thing that come up these days usually is going to be an Amazon trade paperback version of those stories, because those are the easiest circulated stories from me to you. In order to get you into this, Amazon can get it to you within a day and for cheap. So trade paperbacks is the way to go for most of these storylines. I hate to bring it up because I love the paper medium, but it is reality, digital media. MarvelComics.com. So a lot of these things are on digital media. You can buy them digitally or view them digitally. Any way you can get into these stories, I'm all for. Eventually, I have faith that you'll come back to the paper medium because that's where it's at. But I'd rather have you in. I'd rather have you embracing these stories than not at all. So thank you guys for showing up today. Thank you guys for being part of this discussion. Thank you, Vade, for being the co-pilot today. And I will see you guys this Friday, 6:30 Sci-Fi Center Live. At that point, I'll have in a couple hours, I will have seen Top Gun Maverick, so I'll have a review of that one, spoiler free, and a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm pretty sure that'll happen during the week, Strange New World, all kinds of stuff. And then as far as the next Sci-Fi Center presents, we're going to do Frank Miller's Daredevil, and then that'll be one of the last comic book ones we do for a little bit, because even though I'm a comic book guy, I am a science fiction, horror, fantasy, pop culture guy. So we're going to start branching off, like I said, Blade Runner, X-Files. So stay tuned for all that. Click the like button, and we'll see you around.